when you're committed to a character for a long time, especially because if you write it and then also perform it over like 6 months, rather than let's just say 18 days, some metaphysical exchange happens. I really think if you devote yourself to it wholly, you give a part of yourself to that character that character takes away when they leave and they never bring back to you, and you take a piece of the character in return.
Filmmaker Magazine presents Back to One with Peter Rinaldi.
Brit Marling is an actor. Her latest project with frequent collaborator Zal Batmanglij is the FX series A Murder at the End of the World, which is streaming now on Hulu. She sat down with me in New York City to talk about the work.
This first question I'm going to read is sometimes I hate a very good question, right? Because that's annoying with it's so clever.
Oh, I know what you mean.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, when the effort behind it is obvious.
This will never, I don't have any other one written like this, but sometimes English is my first language. It feels like it's a third or fourth.
I have this problem too.
So I just want to read this, okay, just as a way to get going. At which point does the notion, okay, this character is going to be played by me, come into play? And how does that affect the continuing development of the idea you and Zal are batting around? Does it affect it so significantly that you keep the notion at bay as long as possible? Or do you welcome this thought even before the major points are ever fleshed out?
I love this question because this question is making me have to think about it, because sometimes we do a lot of this stuff unconsciously. And in the early days, I really wanted to act and I couldn't find my way into the industry. And even if I could have, there wouldn't have been the parts for me as a young woman that I would have found satisfying or even called to play or felt were politically responsible to play. So I had to become a writer in order to become an actor. I did that. And so those early pieces were really written with me in their genesis in an interesting way. I wanted to play Rhoda in Another Earth, but also the whole idea of it came with me already in its core. And the feeling that I could embody a character that felt crippled by guilt and by a life that seemed almost grasped, but not quite grasped because of this tragic accident, and living with the duality of what your life had become versus what it might have been. I had strong feelings about that, and Mike Cahill and I were interested in this story of Another Earth. And so there was a science fiction premise, and there was this idea of this character, and I understood some of those feelings, and it felt like they came together. And so in that way, they were inseparable. I would say the same is true with Sound of My Voice, though. In Sound of My Voice, my writing partner, Zal Batmanglij, he said to me once, he was like, Brit, you tend to be very, people think of you as so nice or so kind, but they don't know the side of you that I know, which is that when you get angry or you get really eerily calm and clear, and you're quite cutting, actually. And he's like, I've never seen you play that. What if we made a character from that place with a kind of cruelty that's born from a kind of what she at least sees as a clarity? And so Maggie came from that shard of my personality. And then, of course, we leaned more deeply into it. And we're like, well, what if she's a cult leader? And what if she thinks she's a time traveler? And what if she's in this basement and gathering all these followers? And it becomes science fiction. But in those early days, that writing was inseparable from my desire to become an actor. Then I guess Sundance happened and I became an actor, and I could at least go on auditions and stuff, which I'd never been able to do before. And I found going on those auditions or doing screen tests or being offered parts to just play, I would read the scripts I was being offered, and I suddenly saw that wasn't going to change, that even with some amount of now I don't know, access or energy in the town, that I was still in the place of like being the girlfriend or the wife, and I don't even want to say that it's not a bad thing. I don't need to be a lead. I'm always happy to be a supporting character. It's more that in many of those narratives, those women were just not written as humans.
Yeah.
They were just placeholders for like, you could exchange the wife for the coat hanger or the dish towel. Like the humanity wasn't there. And I think many actors who are women or who play women in something, they have a long history of having to become authors in a way as actors to fill those roles, which are so one-dimensional with 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
And there's a great history of that in cinema, like I don't know what Clute would have been without Jane Fonda playing that sex worker and bringing a fullness to that experience that I'm not sure would have been written without her performance authoring it, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And then later, so I think after that realization, I was like, oh, you will never not be a writer because you are not coming of age in a time when the stories can meet you at the place that you want for women to be at in narrative, which is just that there's a fullness of experience, You're not just there to ask the question that prompts, the monologue from your husband. You're there in the story in a dynamic way. And so I was like, okay, I'm committed now to a life of writing and filmmaking. And then to get to the latter part of your question, then it starts to change a little bit because you're a lot more aware. Before these things are quite unconscious. And then you're like, okay, well now we're building, something like the East or the OA, and we have this story or this world or this idea in our minds, and what part could I play in it that would be right, and why, and then of course now in like this current iteration, A Murder at the End of the World, I really wanted to direct and had wanted to direct for a long time. Like I had made a documentary back when I was still in college and had been even a photography and economics major. And so it was kind of like I was always trying to get back to that place, but I couldn't get back to that place without taking a step back from acting to just make it physically possible. Because we're making these big 1-hour dramas or 7-hour movies or however you want to think about them. They were ambitious worlds that, it wasn't like a story about a group of people living together in a house in Echo Park. They're like interdimensional, or, they have so much is required to make them that in the filmmaking of it, we move so quickly. We sometimes shoot 11 pages a day. So it's really hard to be in front of the camera and also be behind it and make the day. So I was like, okay, I got to take a step back from acting. And this story we'd been thinking about for a long time with A Murder at the End of the World needed a Gen Z heroine. It needed somebody whose childhood was formed by the internet. And I could imagine that and try to embody that, but it's a lot more authentic that someone of that generation, first it was important someone of that generation played it, and for me to be able to take a step back from being in front of the camera every day in order to direct. So I guess to answer your point, it keeps shape-shifting. And now that I think about things coming forward, there's something that, Zal and I are working on right now that he would direct potentially and I would act in. And I think the place I've gotten to now is that we actually have to pretend that I'm not going to play it.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
Because at some point you become too self-aware of all the dynamics at play, and you got to be like, okay, let's just tell the story.
It's almost a dereliction of your duty as a writer, right?
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
Because you could be loading it too much, unconsciously even, because knowing you're going to do it.
Yeah, I think that's so right. And also not giving oneself the full range of challenge or filling things in. So like the character isn't as robust on the page because we're bringing a lot of like, well, we know I can do this or I could do that. but if you've got to make the character so robust that not just, a shared imagination with someone else, but it has to read on the page so well that you give it to a stranger who knows nothing about you or your life, and when they read it, they're like, I know who that person is. Like, the robustness of character required to give a stranger that feeling, as you're saying, is really what you need to carry a story forward. And then if I play it well, then I'm so lucky that I get to find
Yes.
Yeah.
When we think of the OA, we immediately think of, like, at least I do, this idea that, like, there are some shows where, like, it only has 2 seasons, but there are people that it's their favorite show of all time, like all time, and it's such a rabid fan base and just a outgrowth of, like, this attention for it, and it's shocking that it only has 2 seasons, and it's like one of those things where there's a bunch of shows on that particular, we want to call it network, where it's just a big question mark about, like, what happened there, like, and this one is a big one because sometimes some of the shows I'm like, I'm not sure there's a giant fan base for that one, but this is the one where that there's question marks and it's just weird.
Yeah.
When that ends, do you have something ready to go that you were cultivating and it ended up being Murder at the End of the World, or do you start from scratch once you realize you're not going to be in that world anymore?
I think in part, you're right that it was weird, but I think in part we sensed the change coming from a ways off. I think even as we were making the second season, you could feel that things were changing within the company. And I think in hindsight, looking at the strikes and the dialogue that the strikes has brought forward, or to the forefront, I think that we were a sort of casualty of the tech company's eventual course correction when they've disrupted a system that they've entered and gained a lot of market share, but underpriced their product, and then at some point have a come to Jesus moment with Wall Street and have to find a way to make good on the fact that they've actually been operating in the red for so long. And I think, so to your point, all those question marks about what happened in that period, in hindsight, there was a realization that many of those stories, ours included, had enormous fan bases that any other network would have been very happy to have had those numbers, and it would have been considered a wild runaway success. But Netflix was in the middle of a model change. So, and we were inside that. And so I guess to answer your larger question, I think we felt that coming. You could tell that things were shifting over there. And I think you can feel that as a person, as a creative person who has to be an entrepreneur, which you really do in the film business now. It's hard to survive if you don't also have your entrepreneur hat on. And so I think there was this feeling that even though we'd planned all 5 chapters of this, 5 books of the story out, that, like, the window was sort of closing. And I hope that the window opens somehow down the road in a new way and we get to go back through. But I think we sense that window closing, and I think, it's all about Batmanglij, who we co-created the OA together. We think a lot about stories between us as happening in a garden, and we're just tenders of the garden. We go in every day and we plant some new seeds with each other, and we fertilize some stuff and we prune some things, and you're just tending to the plants. And one of the plants that had been growing really since the first season of the OA was our, like, growing interest in technology and in trying to talk about technology and the way in which it's leaping us forward and the ways in which it's dismantling us or holding us back. And so those feelings were there, and we had in our minds the idea of a whodunit, and thinking about the whodunit as a genre that was always set in the British manor as the, like, center or seat of power in the world, and how, well, if you're doing a new whodunit, it wouldn't be at the English Manor anymore. A new whodunit that's really asking like what's going on in the world would be set, you know, in Silicon Valley or inside a technology retreat, and who would be all the suspects that we would bring to the table to be asked the questions of how did we get to this place in the world? So those feelings were cooking even as we were writing the second season, and there would be things that we would want to put in the story of the second season of OA that would be like, oh, this isn't the place for that. Like, but we can fertilize that seed over in the garden here. And so then when the OA, you know, was canceled, we still had the garden to go to. There'll always be the garden, you know, nobody can ever take the garden from you, which is an amazing thing. And we found, especially as the pandemic started to happen, that while we were cultivating other stories, you know, there was a film I wanted to make, there was a book we were talking about writing, like all this stuff, for some reason that flower grew first and fastest, and the rose of Darby, who's the lead character in A Murder at the End of the World, just came out, and she was so vivid and in red, and I had a kind of iconic nature from the beginning that we were like, that's the one to clip, you know, and that's why I think you protect yourself in some ways from the inherent rise and falls of what is a tumultuous business that I think will only become more tumultuous as the world is in such an unsettled place. I think is to just constantly be growing a lot of things in your imagination and with other people, you know, and then you always have that harbor in a way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, but there's a big question I have about this garden, and I mean, just to continue with the analogy, like, I don't want anyone else in my garden. I don't understand the idea of collaboration. You have to explain that, and this is a really great collaboration you seem to have with Zal. It seems to be beneficial to you both, like you both like feed off each other, which is just baffling to me. I can't understand, because I just wrote something, right? And if I could imagine having anybody in on that with me, like on the first day, I would realize they were slightly off on what I want this to be. That slight offness would have put me out. No, you're out. Get out. You're gonna ruin
this thing.
You're building a horse. I'm building a donkey. It's similar.
Say donkey.
Yeah, it's similar, but it's not the same, bro. And I can't have you in here.
Yeah, I get that.
You know, but what is it that you're able to let that fear, whatever that is, go, and let the other stuff that works in? How does that happen?
I think a lot of these collaborations come from time. Like, if I think about other people who do that as well, there's a lot of like brother pairs, you know, the Duffer brothers, the Coen brothers, or people that have somehow spent a lot of time in each other's orbit, you know? And I think that, you know, obviously Mike and I wrote and made things from that space. Zal and I have written and made things from that space. We all met in college. We came of age together. Like, a lot of our influences, the books we were reading, the poetry we were taking in, the things we were watching, the conversations we'd have about those things, I think it had a way of creating a kind of language, a common language that we could find words for the inarticulable in together. And so, like, I don't know if it would be as easy for me to meet someone now and be like, let's dive in. I mean, I think it's possible. I think it would be challenging. I think it would have to be one of these things where I'd like read a novel that they'd written or seen a film and felt such a kinship with how they saw the world that I was like, oh, we have our own identities and experiences, but we can meet in a third space together, and we have enough in common in like the Venn diagram of our souls that there's a center there that exists that we could meet at and tell stories in together. And what fun. I mean, like, I like, you know, at the end of the day, I still have to sit at my laptop and write alone, you know, and so does Zal or anybody else. It's like, you can riff all you want together and build a story orally, but at some point when you're putting it on the page, the the scene has to speak to you, the sequence, the act, like, and you've got to find it and what people are saying and how they're moving about the space. And that's a lonely process. And I guess what's been nice, I think, for both Zal and I is at least you share in that loneliness. You know, even if you go spend 3 days on your own writing, you can bring it to someone and be like, does this land?
Right.
And you know that, I think we both know that as each other's first audience, we're never critical from a place of like ego or vanity, that the story is the queen and we're just like handmaidens of the queen. And sometimes your partner can be a better barometer for what the queen wants than you do. And usually if they say it in the right way, you're like, yeah, you're right, that's true. Like if we go down that path, not that it won't be a good path, but it doesn't lead to the center of the labyrinth. You know, it's so, that's not to say that I think there are things I have written on my own or will write on my own, but in this work it can be really isolating, especially, you know, seeing something through from beginning to end by yourself, and the experience can be quite brutal. I think having someone to share in it with, there's a lot of meaning in that, and a lot of not feeling so alone. The world's already quite isolating, no?
Yeah. What did you do with the crippling fear of trying to write something about AI? You know, meaning like, you must have thought, well, of course, things might change in 5 years, and this will just be a period piece, like, you know what I mean? Like we'll look back on this as is that the way you kind of were able to just be like, let's put this aside, like we're dealing with this as a story element. Let's not try and figure out like how we have to be ahead of this.
I love what you're saying. It's interesting because when we started writing it 4 years ago, it was ahead in the sense that we were having to explain to people what algorithms even were and how they functioned 4 years ago. Having to explain to people what deep fakes were, having to talk about large language models and how, you know, AI doesn't learn something, it ingests something. And it doesn't learn something because it's not human, you know? And the constant desire to anthropomorphize what is much scarier when you realize that it's just a data set with no feelings. And so that, you know, as we wrote it and then shot it and then edited it, to watch things come to pass. You know, we had played with an early version of ChatGPT-3 before it was released to the public, because our friend Moxie Marlinspike, who was a tech consultant on the show and who built the app Signal, which is the end-to-end encrypted communication platform, you know, he had helped us get early access to playing with it. And, you know, it had been quite funny when we tried it the first time because it was not very sophisticated. And then when we were in the editing process and it came out into the world and suddenly everyone's like ChatGPT-3 and AI, and, you know, we were like, okay, you know, and it had made a really exponential leap. So you're right to say that we have no idea where it's going. Like, literally in a year from now, we could be just talking about teleportation or I don't know what, you know, like we're only dealing right now with the version of technology that's the 2 times 2 is 4 or 4 times 4 is 6, but we're about to, or sorry, 4 times 4 is 16, but we're about to get into 16 times 16 and then, which I think is 256, I don't know, somebody will check that out for us, I'm sure on the internet. But then after that, it starts to get to numbers that are too hard to hold in your imagination, and they're real hyper objects. And so I guess when we set out to write this, we felt like we can do part for whole. You know, in some ways, it isn't a show about AI at all, any more than it's a show about a smartphone or a show about it. I think what it tries to look at is what are the ways in which technology keeps leading and we're sort of in the wake. You know, and what would it mean if we got out in front of it and started leading with philosophy or other things and having tech go in the wake of that. I think it's questions about that, and I think it's also like we were making something about, wanted to make something about a tech billionaire. And even 4 years ago, for us, it felt like the space was AI. And we were like, well, wouldn't it be cool if he had an AI assistant? And wouldn't it be cool if the voice of that assistant was the voice we love to listen to when we're like listening to profiles or books in bed at night, and we're like listening to Eduardo Ballerini, and then we called Eduardo Ballerini and we were like, what if you play the voice of the AI and then it also inhabit, his body, and Eduardo was amazing. And we tried to be honest in the storytelling about its limitations, which are funny and scary sometimes, and all of it's both. I can talk till the cows come home about how my smartphone is like, eroding my imagination and changing my focus, and that these are the unintended consequences of all the social media I'm involved in. But I also still keep bringing it everywhere with me, so it's doing things for me too. And I don't think we'd be making this podcast without these tools. I don't think I would have become a filmmaker if the prosumer cameras that mimicked 24 frame rates and Final Cut Pro on laptops that you could rent from your school or borrow from a friend or buy made it so that for the first time ever, you didn't have to go to film school to make a film. You could make it in your dorm room. And the same thing happened with music. And music exploded in this way out of dorm rooms and garages. And so it's so, I can't say, it's always a double-edged sword. At least in the realm of this story, the only reason we could write a murder at the end of the world and make it feel real and not like a kind of tongue-in-cheek, like Nancy Drew on a whodunit that's like not really meant to be real, The only reason we could do it is because it's the first time that you could say that a Gen Z detective, a young woman coming of age with the internet, would have logged potentially 10,000 hours of amateur sleuthing online, that she could go to a tech retreat and we, the audience, might find her credible enough to solve the mystery. If that's a narrative we can only pull off because of the gifts that technology has given Gen Z. And at the same time, I think the story tries to contend with all the ways in which that upbringing is also hard and creates limitations as much as it creates these open expanses.
Speaking the English manner, realizing it can't be there, but then realizing it needs to be at a retreat, but then the location of this retreat in Iceland. I don't, as a filmmaker, just watching this. Just watching the interior, forget the exterior where this is, the interior of this place, and realizing that the series is going to basically be set here. Once you realize that, it is kind of mind blowing as a space, as a set or many sets, and it just feels like this feels really good for an audience, and it feels like I don't want to even think about what it was like for you guys to have to deal with this. But tell me about that. Did you? Because it's not like this is the first time you guys are making something, and you're like, we're gonna set it in this giant place, and then somebody gave you the money to do it, and you realized later, wow, this is crazy. You know what it's like to make a show, and so you knew that you wanted to do this in this space. It worked out, but tell me what the ups and downs were of a location like this.
Because I think the location is a character in this story, and it really goes through an arc.
Yes.
You see it as this dazzling center of luxury, and then you're like, is it that? Is it a boutique hotel for the most dazzling people, or is it a fortress, or is it a prison, or is it I think one of the things we've been really lucky about in our storytelling is that we've been really close with Alex DiGirlando, our production designer, for so many years. He worked on The East and worked on OA and now did this with us. And he he's an incredible storyteller within the realm of production design. And I think the moment we started talking about this hotel as a space, early days when Zal and I were writing it, and we always saw it as a circular thing so that we could use the sort of pacing of the circular hotel as like the hands of time, and be shuttling back and forth in time always as a way of pacing that circle. And you get on Google and you're like, where are the boutique hotels with 12 to 18 rooms that are circles, that are in snowy locations, that are very remote? Enter, and nothing comes back. So we went to Iceland and we scouted, and we, of course, didn't find anything that met all the criteria of the very carefully story that we had written. But we did find 2 locations that could serve as entry and exits, and we knew from enough of the work inside OA that one of the things that's so important in VFX coming across and feeling real is just that the actors have something immediate to interact with and that grounds the rest of the VFX. And so we found there's a place called Volk Baths, these amazing baths in Iceland that are, natural hot springs. And they just had this long concrete tunnel that disappeared into a field of grass, it seemed like. And then if you came out the other side, the baths were situated there. So we pulled out of the van and stepped out of the car, and I was like, wait, could we just VFX the top of the hotel on top of this setting? We have the actors literally walk in this door, and then we use the baths. And then there was another location that had a set of baths and a spa and an entry and exit into the snow. And we basically stitched those two places together as the points in which you, especially a lot in chapter 1, see the characters interact with that space and see the top ring of the hotel, and the bottom ring is practical and real. So you're marrying the practical with the visual effect, and then it suddenly has this uncanny thing of it is real, And then after that, we didn't have to, obviously for cost reasons, we have to be judicious about how many times we're going to show the exterior and these kinds of things. And then Alex had the brilliant idea of we couldn't get stage space big enough to build an entire circle, nor did we have the money to do that. So Alex was like, I'm going to build half.
Wow.
And we're going to do a 2-story set that's half. And in the first round, it'll set as the lobby and the library above and the set of rooms. And we'll dress it, shoot everything out that's in there, and then we'll redress and basically flip it for the other side of the semicircle. And it was amazing. I mean, the first time we walked onto those sets, and Alex has this ability, to talk about the relationship between different craftspeople. I used to tell Alex that certain sets he builds, I write in my scripts NAR, which is no acting required. And it's no acting required because Alex has made a space so real that all you have to do is walk into it and be, and it will give you what you need. The HAPS, basement laboratory in OA, he came up with that hexagonal structure that is that sort of glass prisons with the river going underneath it. And that's all Alex's imagination, having that river as a way that could touch each cell. And you walked into that space, and Emery Cohen and I used to joke all the time. We were like, you don't need to imagine any of it. You don't need to do all this extensive homework because Alex has done the homework. And so when you come into the space, you immediately feel, trapped and like a lab rat. And and so I think Alex's hotel did that really very much for A Murder at the End of the World. Clive walked into it and was like, this is one of the nicest hotels I've ever been in. And I get the feeling Clive has been in some good hotels,
probably,
So if he was impressed, I feel like we've done our job.
So, like you said, there's this beautiful red flower in this garden growing, and then there comes a point where you have to turn that into a person, and that has to embody this character. I mean, what was that process like of finding this actor to play this?
I mean, I think in a sense we got really lucky. I think we felt nervous when we were starting to give the scripts to people because a thing happened that hadn't happened to us before, which is people would read the scripts and they'd just be like, Darby is iconic. Why does everybody say iconic? It's like they've talked to each other. Why do they all say this? And we found it kind of frustrating and even a little intimidating because then you've got to find somebody.
You've got to find an icon that young.
Who probably hasn't had a tremendous amount of experience, but you have to know that they can inhabit the role, and then you're asking for a lot because the person's in every scene,
Right.
and feels so fully formed already, and so I think it was, it was a lot. But when we met, we had both seen Emma Corrin's work in The Crown, and I really felt when I watched that performance, a lot of times when you're doing like a biopic or you're playing somebody who's a real person, there's a feeling that the person's done so much research and then they're like sort of trying to get all the research right in some way, and you kind of feel the math a little bit. But with Emma, I felt Emma was Princess Diana, like that on some molecular level they became. I think that's where acting can get into a kind of really interesting place of like some molecular change. I don't think all actors do that, but I think some actors can. And when we Zoomed with Emma the first time, it was just an incredible conversation. And Emma themselves is very interested in true crime, very interested in amateur sleuthdom. So there was right away, I think Emma was drawn to the character and the story, and we were drawn to Emma, and it kind of felt like one of those weird dates with destiny. I'm not sure I've ever felt that in casting before, but I think Elliot Page is a friend of mine, and Elliot Page described playing Juno as the feeling of that, like reading it on the page and just knowing I can inhabit this thing. And I think there are just certain characters that meet up with certain people in time, and they have this date with destiny. It's like, I'm sure there were other people who could have maybe played Pretty Woman, but nobody could have played it like Julia Roberts. And there was some marriage of Vivian and Julia Roberts that like was like a nuclear reactor of energy, And I think Emma's an astounding actor. And
Amazing.
I felt like once I had that Zoom with Emma, I felt like I only knew Darby on set, and I only realized that once we'd stopped shooting and I saw Emma, and we met up at this vintage store looking for different stuff, and I hadn't seen them in a long time, and I hugged them. And when I hugged them, I was like, oh, I'm hugging a different person. I'm hugging someone I've never hugged before, which is the Emma I met on the Zoom, like, I don't even know at this point, a year ago.
Yeah.
Like, and I haven't hugged Emma because I just met Emma on Zoom, but I have hugged Darby a lot. So that was a pretty profound experience, and the whole cast is incredible. I think Harris Dickinson is a wild talent.
You have fucking Joan Chen.
Joan Chen.
You have fucking Joan Chen. When I saw
Joan Chen.
I mean,
she's amazing.
Yeah.
She's amazing because I really believe, like, it was very challenging to play that role, and I believe Alicia Braga.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Like, we got really...
It must have been so cool to just settle in with everyone and realize, like, this is your... You know what I mean? Like, because it's like one of those ensemble kind of things where everyone's in a closed place and you can just settle in. Was that true? Where, like, did people feel like... Or was it just too crazed to kind of think of it like that? Almost like sometimes when people like what's that? Women talking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like one set, like a bunch of people.
Yeah.
They made it like it's like a camp time.
Yeah.
Was it kind of like that, or was
I think there was that vibe for sure, and especially in Iceland because we were all in a foreign country. And there's like a banding together, and you're all in a similar, like hotels together and eating meals together because you're not going home to your families and stuff. And I think that was wonderful, and especially the stuff at the end between Harris Dickinson and Emma Corrin's character when they're on the road and we're telling this journey of their love story, this like epic sort of Badlands, story of through the American West. I felt like we were all on that road trip together, because we had reduced down to a really small core crew, so it wasn't very many people, and we were all in the middle of nowhere in Utah having every meal together and enjoying being outside and mask free finally, so that was true summer camp vibes. in the hotel was harder because we were all going through the story together as an ensemble. And so there's the story is about not quite knowing who you can trust or how or for how long and so,
Interesting.
That's an intense space to occupy for a while. But we had, every actor on this was like, it was a dream to work with.
Somewhere I heard you say, maybe during the editing of the OA, that you kind of you felt like you had to keep your character at the ready in case, throughout the whole editing process, in case there was reshoots and stuff like that. I found that fascinating. Did that have to happen on this?
Yes, because I can't ever take off my producer's hat, which is like, we're probably going to need reshoots. And so if you let fully go of the character, it's so hard to get them back. I remember like thinking we had dropped, there was a scene that we had written that we had been unable to shoot in Iceland because we ran out of time. And I was always thinking like, the ending's not fully going to come together without that scene. And it didn't quite. And so we went back to Iceland to pick up that piece that we had needed. And it wasn't until a month after that Zal was finally like, oh wow, like you finally let go of Lee. And sometimes I don't even know it fully. I think it's easier for people who know you to see it. Like I could feel it in Emma when they let go of Darby. And Zal was just like, and once he said it, I was like, oh my God, that's so true. Like I had been still existing as that, woman. And that was an intense place to be. And it was nice to let Lee go finally. And it was nice to let OA go. I do think when you're committed to a character for a long time, especially because if you write it and then also perform it over like 6 months, rather than let's just say 18 days, some metaphysical exchange happens. I really think if you devote yourself to it wholly, you give a part of yourself to that character that character takes away when they leave and they never bring back to you, and you take a piece of the character in return. Like there is the most mundane sense of that, I no longer bite my nails. But I bit my nails all my life, and then I decided that Nina Azarova in OA2 was not a woman who was anxiously biting her nails. She was a woman who had long manicured nails and took care of them. And I could, even if I put that powder, that terrible powder on my fingertips, I could not stop biting my nails. But the moment I had to take on Nina, I just stopped.
Wow.
And then when Nina left, she took some parts of me, I'm sure, but I kept the nails. And I've never had the urge to bite them since then. So I think these weird exchanges to occur, you know? And to get back to your first question, maybe that's part of why I unconsciously author some of these things, is that it's like a direction I'm looking to grow or a thing I'm looking to reckon with. And I'm hoping for a encounter.
Yes. I hear this a lot from actors. Yes.
That makes so much sense to me.
Going back to the analogy of the garden, which I love, what is the water that you use to water this stuff when you're not clipping it and using it?
That might be the question of what life is.
Yes.
And what is art making?
Yes.
What is the water?
Yeah.
I think the water, if you asked me 5 years ago, I would have said another thing. If you asked me 5 years from now, I'd probably say a different thing. But my best guess as to what the water is right now is it's funny. There's like no good Western word for it. What keeps coming to mind is like, whenever I'm sick or unwell, which often happens after you spend, a year breaking yourself shooting these things. There's a woman who's a traditional Chinese medicine healer who I see, who's just incredibly gifted in the healing arts and talks often about just chi or energy, life force, and I don't know what we would describe that as in Western medicine. I doubt we even have a name for something that we can't measure. But I think very specifically, it's in the immeasurable realm, the unquantifiable realm, And I think you do pour that quite literally into the garden out of love for the flowers, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess out of this exchange that hopefully happens with the audience, where you clip these things from the garden and you arrange them in a vase and you know, put them on the table, and you hope that it brings people something. And if it does, and you feel that, and you feel met by that, I think you get some of that life force back in a new way. And there's maybe some desire amongst all of us to cycle and recycle energy, and to maybe, is this getting too far out?
No.
And to maybe know that, like, I think probably we're actually not individuals, and that the big trouble with Western thought is its emphasis on the individual, and that we're actually much more connected and interrelated than we even understand with each other and with ecology, you know?
Yeah.
And I think it's the desire to exist in a cycling of water, which is life with each other, which is just this constant interchange of emotions and feelings and ideas, and having it break down the boundaries of the self. Because if we are both moved by the same thing, when I say the garden metaphor to you, and you come back to me with the water analogy, and you teach me something I didn't know about the garden, I'm just like, thank you. You know, like, I think that's what we're all doing here.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my best guess today on planet Earth, you know. As you know, I don't know. Do aliens harvest that water in some way? I'm not sure. Yeah.
I want to believe it. I want to take that. I want that to be true.
Yeah.
Brit Marling, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been such a wild pleasure. I'm so glad that you have these deep dives with people into the art form, because it's so rare to talk about this stuff.
Back to One is a production of Filmmaker Magazine, which is a publication of The Gotham, formerly IFP. Listen to back episodes of this podcast at filmmakermagazine.com or wherever you get your podcasts.